But without further ado, let me do a really quick introduction of our amazing presenters. Shafika is the Economic Justice Programs Director at the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, where she works to achieve economic justice for survivors through programming and policy reform. And of course, I moved my computer and moved all my stuff. But so a little bit more about Shafika. In this role that she currently has, she developed and secured funding for an equitable entrepreneurship model, which has harnessed survivor skills, supporting them, supporting their dreams and economic independence for their lives. Shafika has diverse economic justice work, or her diverse economic justice work has spanned supporting shelters and grassroots programs. In addition to that, she spent 3 years on the anchor team to close the Atlanta City Detention Center, known as the Extra Jail, and turn it into a center for equity and wellness. So we are in such good hands right now. We are also joined by Mona Muro, who is my colleague at the Texas Council on Family Violence. In Mona's role, she is the economic justice consultant based in Texas. Over the last decade and a half of her career in this nonprofit sector, she has championed anti-gender bias violence work with grassroots organizations, community members, and fought to keep survivor voices at the heart of the movement. During this past legislative session, Mona spends her time advancing policy for people impacted by gender-based violence and has overseen state and national economic justice policy and systems. She's an experienced policy professional, as I just shared with you all, who focuses on immigration, consumer rights. She is also a granddaughter of Mexican immigrants, a Tejana, a social worker, a dog mom, among so many other amazing things. I will stop talking so that I can send the mic over to Mona and Shafika. By all means, please take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Roy. I think I'm going to start us off today with a few kind of grounding pieces, and then Shafika is going to take over and share more info and dig deeper for us. I just want to do a quick check on the PowerPoint. Is that visible to everyone? If we can give a thumbs up, or just anybody want to say yes and unmute really quick.
It's visible.
Perfect. Thank you. I know with all the Zoom funness, sometimes I can't see if it's actually working and on there. So thank you, Roy, for the introduction, for introducing Shafika and I. And we share a lot of spaces together. I just want to make a quick connection. Shafika and I share a lot of EJ spaces together at the national level, both being at at different kind of state levels. We've had the opportunity to meet in person pre-COVID. And I'm so fortunate to be able to share this opportunity to present together with her today. So we are talking about centering economic justice today and what that looks like from a prevention standpoint. Wanted to ground us a little bit, there we go, in some background as we talk about these different intersections of the work. It's important for us to have some framing and some starting points for us. I have a couple of pieces here for us to kind of think about this work as we start our conversations, really starting from the place that we're all connected, and that this work is all connected. We see racism, white supremacy, capitalism, colonialism, and all of these different isms connected together here at the center point of violence. And the reason why this is an important piece for us to start with is that because it's all connected, we're all connected in this work. And in particular, we're all connected in this EJ work. That's what our conversation is really centering around today. When we think about these different dynamics of oppression, we want to also frame them with our economic justice, kind of eyes, and with a narrowing and focus towards the elements that have created the world that we're living and operating in today. I want to make a quick point for credit here. There was a bit of a error on the slide, the English slide, just to note really quick. The credit for the image is from Dr. Rupa Maryash. That is the person that did the image. There was some an edit there, but I just wanted to make a quick note of that. And so as we think about our deeper kind of economic intersections, this history and legacy of supremacy and capitalism, those things are, again, what kind of shapes the landscape for the EJ system that we're operating in today. We can see the intersections here with white supremacy, with slavery. We are often, our history thinks about domination and exploitation of people for profits. That is often a term and a phrase that's used often, but we don't really get into where that comes from and why it's important to understand all these connections, and in particular connection to our gender-based violence work. When we think about here in this visual, white supremacy and genocide, we're thinking about resource grabs. We want to reflect on the fact that, history has shown us that colonialism really was that history that led to resource grabbing, right? Where folks took over land, that was a resource. That was a generational history of trauma that exists within our history of colonialism, supremacy, and capitalism, because that resource then begat other resources, right? So giving us a little bit of framework around how these things are interconnected and how they also create the legacy that we live in today is important. From the gender-based violence movement, we think about male supremacy. We see that in our work all the time when we're working with survivors, if we're out in community and we're hearing about violence that's occurring with the youth in schools and or in general workplace violence. We think about, from an economic standpoint, unpaid labor, right? Invisible labor that we often think about that goes unnoticed, unacknowledged, unvalued. And that is largely as a result and typically disproportionately impacts people who are females in our environment. And they're taking on caretaking work, they're taking on household work, they're taking on different kinds of unpaid work that isn't recognized, but it often is as a direct result of those supremacy pieces. So grounding us in a little bit of those macro level concepts and how they directly have created the economic environment that the folks experiencing violence in our general communities are operating is really important for us to kind of think about. When I think about this work, it's often, as a result of working with survivors, creating policy or processes that are helping to support economic liberation and freedom and well-being for survivors. Because what we know is that a survivor's ability to gain freedom, financial freedom, is really tied to their economic well-being. Having access to resources, whatever they may be, it doesn't always have to be money, but resources does support freedom and being safer from violence. And then just really thinking about kind of this particular connection, we want to reinforce that all of these pieces are connected. The fundamental value, understanding that power and control, which is what our gender-based violence work, right, that foundational information is rooted in, is that understanding that abuse exists and thrives because of power and control. Colonialism, supremacy, and capitalism are also, sharing those similar contexts, and they're allowed to thrive because of power and control. So when we're thinking about kind of practical, tangible things in the work that we're doing today, we've got our kind of macro framing. We understand these connection points. And we also want to think about how do we go out into the world and put that into practice? How are we talking about it? How are we meeting with community and being in community with folks? One of the things we want to think about is, awareness and education. That's what that is a key fundamental piece of prevention work, right? But also ensuring that that work and that education is framed and brought to community and to the folks that we're working with in a trauma-informed way. And it couldn't have lent better to that in the panel that just kind of finished up, in some of the work that folks were talking about, working towards creating that trauma and compassionate framework. So it feels like it lent really, really well. Knowing that all of those foundations that we just talked about are all rooted in violence, that means they all come with trauma. And so we have to think about making sure that compassion and trauma-informed approaches, language is used as we think about these pieces. And then also understanding that we can't just rely on education, we can't rely on trauma-informed processes, but we also have to think about and simultaneously conduct this work and this systems work by reinventing and dismantling at the same time. There's been a lot of conversations and there's a lot of current initiatives around reinvestment, divestment, and reinvestment. And those things have to occur simultaneously. It's very difficult to take down one particular initiative without also supporting another initiative. So we want to make sure that the needs of the community are, the crisis pieces are getting addressed at the immediate level, as well as that longer term work happening as well. And one of the things as we think about prevention workers are the workers that are out in community. They're out at schools, they're out talking with folks in different businesses, healthcare agencies, whether they're, or not, we're in universities and other kind of public spaces. When we are the folks that are out, there every day, present, building relationships, that's the opportunity to ensure that this EJ framework, this multiple prong approach, is consistently at the forefront of conversation. That we're talking about all of these different dynamics that have to occur simultaneously. One of the biggest things that our country, and being in Texas, being in the South, is a constant battle, is the shifting away from framing that the work that we do, that our economic work, that wealth is built on this bootstraps individualism concept. And so I would challenge us as a domestic violence movement, as prevention workers, as someone who works in policy, to continue to shift our language, our education, to be more encompassing of interconnectedness and relational worldview concepts, as opposed to individualism. Excuse me. When we embrace individualism, that often negates a lot of what we know history has supported, in the sense that we know we are all interconnected, and then all this work is interconnected. I'm sorry, Shafika, would you take over for a minute?
Sure. I actually, give me one second. So I visually can't see the PowerPoint, just because of my disabilities. So I can kind of
You can share your parts. I would be okay as well.
Okay, sure. Absolutely. Thanks so much, Mona. Yeah, grab yourself water, do what you need to do. So something I kind of want to pull out from Mona's part, we're going to jump a little bit ahead, but this is really part of that big picture, is in focusing on this idea of, we aren't asking people to do this bootstraps narrative of, oh, if you just work hard enough, you can achieve, but there are real tangible things that we think programs, coalitions, programs, like grassroots agencies, whatever they are, can actually implement to help support survivors. Because at the end of the day, We need to be working all the time to attack systems, but we also need to be kind of giving people those immediate options, sort of what was talked about in that last bit of, if someone can come and say, oh, I have job training and X, Y, and Z, but they're totally, the survivor will not hear that until some more basic things are met. And so in terms of economic programming, that's us supporting everything from, higher living wages, but in the direct support, actual cash support. And so something, in building this work together, Mona and I talked a lot about how people are always so hesitant to give survivors direct cash support because of, and we know this, right? Our funders make it difficult. Oh, what are they going to do with it? Oh, are they doing the right things? Yada, yada, yada. But every ounce of economic research shows that that really is the best thing for people. So we have to think creatively, okay, how can we implement cash support programs, that at least give people a bit of extra cash and let them kind of choose on their own what is to be done with it, not something that we are dictating has to be done in this way. And I will say, I apologize because I normally have slides, but I've actually been in a hospital for 2 weeks with a family member. So it was poor talk timing on my part. So, I hope folks can at least just bear with it as a conversation. So something we've developed is this entrepreneurship model of giving folks direct cash assistance. And I know people probably think, oh, well, entrepreneurship, that's kind of the epitome of individualism. But we actually make sure that survivors, when they're doing this, get connected with each other, get connected in a broader ecosystem of other people. And also one of the biggest things that we see with entrepreneurship is actually how people often then give back to their own communities. Whereas like large companies aren't quite always doing that in direct service of communities. So you think of who sponsors your little league teams, who, does the school fundraisers, who does these things. And a lot of times it's little companies or it's parents who bake or parents who do this and support these things on their own, who helps, your Boys and Girl Scout troops, things like that. And so, in our coalition, I kind of talk about this a lot because it gives people a real practical model of something that has happened instead of just saying, this is what should happen, this is what should happen. So we developed something called Don't Knock the Hustle. And what that was is basically that we were seeing that survivors had ideas and people were like, not time for you. It's that's for later. We can come back to your dreams and your aspirations at a better time in life. And we wanted to really challenge against that. And so with Don't Knock the Hustle, it's giving survivors a network of actual practical support, to start their small businesses and support their ideas, but it also has that direct cash assistance portion to it. So it started out at 500. In the coming year, we actually hope for that to be 1,500 per survivor. And so it's ever expanding. And that was giving survivors the choice and not saying, here's $500 and we need, an absolute itemized receipt of everything that happened. But it was, these are your ideas, these are your creative pursuits. And here's, cash assistance to help make that happen. And we aren't naive to the fact that that's a small amount of money, but with any program, you really have to start somewhere before you can really expand it more. And so, something we really want to emphasize, because again, it's hard to separate, well, how can you support people individually without that being this like bootstraps narrative? But basically what we were seeing is that when wealthy people have big ideas, everyone's so encouraging, oh, they're a trailblazer, they're incredible, yada, yada, yada. But when poor folks have ideas of things they'd like to do, creative endeavors they have, kind of like I said earlier, they're pushed back on really heavily. And it's, well, the warehouse down the road is hiring. So I live in Georgia. Georgia is big town, just kind of like Tennessee, big time chicken country. So the poultry plants, without any discussion on what effect that was actually having on survivors' confidence and self-esteem, and how incredibly difficult that type of work is to be working in the poultry plants or in manufacturing, settings and things like that, as opposed to something that actually not only fills someone's bank account, but actually fills their spirit. And so that was kind of one of these big differences. Unfortunately, measuring like your filled spirit isn't kind of a grant metric. And so you have to think of like, okay, well, what does that then kind of also correlate to? And it does, it correlates really directly to people having higher confidence in themselves, way better self-esteem, not returning to abusive relationships because of that. And the financial component, where in Georgia, there was actually an extensive study by our Budget and Policy Institute, where women specifically who were entrepreneurs were on average making an income of $15.79 an hour, but versus, the kind of factory wage, which was around $9 to $11 an hour. And none of that includes those added confidence, self-esteem, individual benefits that are gained, plus those community benefits I kind of touched on earlier. And so that was kind of a big piece of why we keep Don't Knock the Hustle going, and why we keep promoting kind of this entrepreneurship model. But we like to really call it an equitable entrepreneurship model without exploitation. Because we know very well that these types of models can be kind of set up and can be really exploitative. Like, well, I guess your idea didn't work out, you just didn't work hard enough. And so that's kind of, a big thing that we do. And again, only with, like, if we didn't have the direct cash assistance program, I would personally be far less enthusiastic to sit here and tell you guys all about it. But because it actually kind of, as the saying goes, like puts your money where your mouth is, and says, no, we don't just believe in this as some type of like value. Oh, entrepreneurship, good. Yeah, that's fine. No, it's actually, we believe in it so much that there's going to be direct cash for anyone who, wants to just try. Not cash for someone who's perfectly successful, but for someone who just wants to try. And so that's really important to us. So with the,
I was just going to share that I really appreciate the reframing of the entrepreneurship piece being an individual element, right? Because, being from, Texas and from the South, a lot of the communities that I work with and have experience working with here are Latinos, Latinas, Latinx, and they are there's lots of sole proprietors, lots of entrepreneurs, and they all are very community-based. Oftentimes, if one doesn't have a particular service or product, they refer to other folks. So there's a community within that community of individual owners. And so there, to your point about not being, entrepreneurship not being exploitive, it's often also wealth producing for others. I was just going to share that. And I think we have to do a lot of work around reframing that narrative. So I just appreciate that, because it is a very important piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even with that immigrant piece, because a lot of times also when we think of entrepreneurship, and this is what I really want to hammer out of people, is the notion that it's only for someone who's way later down the road, like not, someone in it. And it's just not true. So myself and Mona, are both, well, I guess I don't want to speak for Mona, but immigrants and of immigrant backgrounds. And, for me, when I got married, so I'm Middle Eastern. So when I got married, when we had any type of familial, traditional familial party, every single vendor, every single person is, Middle Eastern, is almost exclusively Middle Eastern women as well. And so, this notion of, oh, this is later, this is for later, it's just not true. Like, it would be really young women who are doing hair and makeup, making a ton of money off of it, because it's a particular, like landscape of, cultural needs and necessities. It's always women making the traditional clothing. It's people who are even like helping find jewelry. It's people who are doing everything from just like stage setup and these things that oftentimes in American context don't quite exist as much. But even if we think of like, religious contexts, of finding wedding boutiques, and I'm just going to stick with the wedding example because it's one that I personally, myself really went through, but it's wedding boutiques that made kind of more modest wedding dresses. All of these things were women-led businesses, some extremely religious women, some younger women, some older women, and it was all means that they were the economic engines of their families. A lot of times, and I don't think this is, just a coincidence, a lot of times, women who were single moms. And so it was just sure that they ultimately didn't find that they needed to return to these kind of crummy relationships that they were in, because they actually had something that they were pursuing. So again, it was supporting them financially. Their community was using it. They were, supporting other members of the community. And it's just a lot less individualistic than I think a lot of times the way entrepreneurship gets viewed, which is, this is for me, this is to advance myself, and that's it. And there's not a lot of other gain that's coming from it. So with that being said, I did just kind of want to share that as like one, I find our model in Georgia to be, fairly successful. We've been able to expand it from just sort of a few dozen survivors who are getting help to it's now a $100,000 direct cash assistance fund for survivors, which, still itself is smaller, but that number itself is now even expanding. So with that being said, another thing we promote in our economic justice work is kind of always thinking about these things collectively. So I think we kind of beat the horse to death, if you will, talking about it in terms of entrepreneurship, but it's also about thinking about the context of what's going on around us in our society. So something that's really big, folks might know about, might not know about, is how many strike waves there have been lately of people who are low-wage factory workers who are now striking together. So big one that was all over the news before was Nabisco, and that was hugely successful. Another big one people might be hearing, especially now with the latest news, is the IATSE. So that's like film workers and all these folks striking. And you think of these things and you think of film and you think of these big directors, tons of people working in film getting paid $10, $15 an hour with 14-hour work days, and then of course we think of a couple of years back when it was teachers unions, folks who educate our children and are making really poor wages, often working 2 or 3 jobs to kind of make their ends meet. And so it's, obviously it's not as though we're working at like our organization isn't directly a labor nonprofit, but it's actually helping survivors at least talk about, hey, you're at the factory and you find that you're being really mistreated in this way. You're probably not alone. And so it's getting people to see their individual circumstance as far more collective. And whether that's by using, like modern things in the news, whether that's actually just talking to folks as their advocate, it's just doing things that always frame economics as a collective problem and not some type of individual failing. And so, just with unions being in the news so much lately and strikes being in the news so much lately, it's really something I wanted to, I would be remiss not to mention. And then lastly, kind of on my part, and then I'm going to kick it back to Mona to kind of pick up where she had left off, but it was kind of read to you guys in my bio and whatnot, but it's about thinking about economic justice also from a prevention lens, specifically for the most marginalized survivors, often those being the ones who are incarcerated. And so one of the things that I've been really proud of doing, and it happens in a lot more cities, and not even just cities, states, large towns, you can kind of look for it and see if those opportunities are available to you, is this close the jail work. And so I'm particularly very proud of it in the sense that, just to give an ounce of background, in Atlanta, we had a jail known as the Atlanta City Detention Center, specifically built in the 90s for the 96 Olympics. Literally, I mean, it's an open fact of sorts to get homeless people off the streets so the city looked better for the Olympics. And then it just became a jail filled with people, for crimes of poverty, public urination, or jaywalking. Literally, jaywalking was in the top 15 things folks were arrested for and put in the city detention center for. Traffic violations, tons and tons of traffic violations, very, very, very petty misdemeanor crimes. And then over the years, with bail reform, with criminalization reform, the jail population, was able to hold some 1,200 people. On average, holds 70 or so. And so it was like, well, this is a total waste of city money. Like there's some $20, $30 million going to this jail. and yet we keep telling people, oh, we don't have more money for mental health. Oh, we don't have more money for these other resources. And so it's been a multi-year process, and the jail is still not fully closed. It's supposed to be fully closed June, this coming June, but it's literally looking at your own towns and cities where you literally reside and seeing like, what here isn't actually making economic sense and might be making things worse for people economically. And I will say, you know, this isn't something, it was something I started doing myself just as an activist and organizer in the community, but it's something I formally do with the Georgia Coalition. So it's not some type of work that you have to separate out from your domestic violence prevention work. It's extraordinarily connected. I mean, we know here how many women are incarcerated because of things related to domestic violence, whether they happen in that immediate moment of incarceration, whether they happened later down the road, but had stemmed from domestic violence. And so it's so connected. I mean, it is very much something that I truly believe should, and at least, you know, with us in Georgia, we're very fortunate, but should be a part of everyone's economic prevention work, or even just prevention work in general, to make sure that really the most marginalized survivors, those behind bars, are not forgotten about when we're doing our work. I know, you know, in Texas, tons of things around like immigrants and probably folks in ICE facilities, things like that. And so that would be, you know, also great to hear from.
Yeah.
And now so I'm going to kind of, so I just wanted to sort of push to that. You know, I know we talked about the entrepreneurship model and, you know, the collective work, but I wanted to really mention it. I, you know, intentionally kind of included it in the bio for this session, on how that really is itself economic prevention work and taking city funds and making them more equitable for people.
And I think that's really a huge piece that I think in our domestic violence work, we can work to reframe and really think about and recognize the fact that entrepreneurship work isn't an individual piece, right? And one of the things I was going to also share around, in particular, folks who are building, you know, wealth and their income through this particular model is a lot of times if they're BIPOC owned, there is that connection to financial systems, which we know also, again, kind of operate in the world that we live in, where folks may have less access to capital. So as we're centering Black, Indigenous survivors and our communities, we often have to also think about the complexities of the less access to credit, to capital. We do often see those particular folks go to friends, family, which are also other folks of color, as their first investors. And so we are often the supporters of each other when folks do uplift their own businesses. And so, again, I think as we recognize how we all are in relation and that we all are as communities are supporting each other, we do actually have a more accurate perspective of what entrepreneurship means, and away from that individualistic bootstraps myth that isn't quite accurate for a lot of folks. One thing that Shafika, you brought up around investment of kind of community and money and divestment away from the examples of the jail that you proposed is that there is this kind of active model that's going around in different parts of the country, and I'm particularly interested in. So you mentioned it doesn't have to always be at the center of your work, but it's also connected, is, you know, in relation to capital, to access to money in our communities at the local level. We're seeing this idea of publicly owned banks come up. So I've seen it in California. There's been another one, I think that's in New Jersey, that's starting to kind of conceptualize potentially. And that is where cities, municipalities own the institution and reinvest in the institution. I'm sorry, I might have another cough fit. So the public bank piece really supplies capital, supplies wealth, supplies opportunity for anybody really to be able to come to this particular entity, and that's owned by the municipality, just like our public utilities are. I'm in a city where electricity and water are both owned by the municipality. And so those are services to the city that the city has deemed that everybody needs to be able to have access to, and we need to be able to at least, present the opportunity for that. Public banking can offer something similar and reinvest in community and have less of that philosophy of exploitation and making money on top of money on top of money, and instead move towards investment in the community itself, because it is publicly ran like a utility. So it's something that I'm particularly interested in, especially because I'm in a city where the city has taken on multiple levels of public investment. And so that's also kind of an more of a relational initiative, as opposed to kind of continuing to invest in like private businesses. We're investing in our community that people are living in, that people are, creating families and staying in. So I just wanted to share that last piece because it also kind of felt like it dovetailed off of the examples of entrepreneurship and capital that Shafika, you had been talking about as well. And I'm again apologizing for my coughing fits here.
No, you're totally fine, Mona. I'm sorry. I feel like between Mona and I, we've had some ill days in these last couple of weeks. So I do want us, if it's okay, and then Mona, let me know if there's any kind of closing statements, closing remarks you'd like to make, to open up the floor to questions. I want people to feel comfortable kind of asking or even talking to one another, not just asking us different things related to economic justice.
Feel free to unmute yourself as well. One question that I thought about as we're kind of preparing for this panel is, what would some of the economic justice initiatives or priorities be for you all? What would, if you could prioritize something today, you had the ability to start the programming, there weren't any barriers, what would be at the top of y'all's priorities right now today? If anybody wants to chat that in, I can read it out loud, or if you want to unmute, sorry.
Hi, folks. This is Roy. I'm not sure if this is what you're exactly thinking about, Mona and Shafika, but, my particular realm that I work in is prevention. And so, we do a lot of presentations. A lot of us are in communities promoting values, trying to re-envision values, to your point, like dismantling the system while also rebuilding the system in a very trauma-informed way. So my question or my thought is, are there suggestions, or do you have ideas, maybe as people who are slightly removed from prevention in some ways, in how to incorporate this into your lessons? Should you have an economic justice lesson or framework as part of your curriculum? Or so that's kind of what I'm thinking about right now, is how do we as preventionists just drive this conversation in our community? I think you shared a lot already, but I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a good question, Roy. I think, something that comes to mind for me in terms of, when we're educating on values, or when we're kind of educating on things more big picture, is really focusing in on the notion that economic distress is not like an individual failing. And I think that's one of the biggest things that becomes a real eye-opener for people, not just domestic violence survivors, but people in poverty, things like that, that their economic situation isn't because of some, moral failing, because, they allowed themselves to be in domestic violence, or, some notion like this. And so that's definitely something I would think of, in addition to what Mona was talking about, which is actually, prevention workshops can also include discussions on credit, discussions on finances, opening the door on these more taboo subjects that people often don't talk about with one another.
And Roy, the Allstate Foundation, one has kind of some basic curriculum on a lot of the pieces that Shafika just shared as far as those tangible education pieces that would be helpful to curriculums. And they also have grant funding for folks who are whose target audience is in youth and broader community. And that funding is really looking at learning healthy financial behaviors. And so I do think that there is an area of opportunity to complement those two pieces together. On like the direct service, it would be, what is financial abuse? What does that look like? On the prevention side, I think that there's opportunity to really highlight what healthier financial practices are, as opposed to like waiting, right, to experience the financial abuse. The other thing I would say is that I know that prevention folks oftentimes have that foundational work of the intersectionalities of the levels of oppression and in their prevention work. And I would say that we want to always ground that as we complement with the tangible education pieces, so that we don't support narratives that folks, again, as Shafika just shared, so we're not supporting narratives that like poverty is because of bad choices, right? We have to contextualize the history, the systems that currently exist, as we also live the daily element of it, right? So that would be an offering to support some of those pieces. One thing I would share is I just came off of a conversation around creating safer workplaces. And I think that is a perfect intersection for prevention work. That is broader community. It's where we're always spending so much time. And so how do we create safe and healthy workplaces? This was for kind of more corporate, bigger businesses, that's definitely an area of opportunity as far as being able to be out in community. Oftentimes nonprofits that are doing this work may be able to engage in work that is supporting them financially as well. It doesn't always have to be a community service, right? If we're thinking about the models that we just talked about, folks doing this work also need to be compensated for this work. And so we don't want to like reinforce exploitation, right? Because someone might work at a nonprofit, but rather we want to be able to support and share our, information, what we understand about dynamics of violence, how they all intersect in different sectors like workplaces, right? And we also want to think about that when it comes to creating safe and healthy workplaces for ourselves. And so it doesn't mean that domestic violence itself is happening in our workplaces, but we can create safe workplaces in our daily lives when we're having conversations with each other. So I would offer those two things. I think the workplace piece with corporations and businesses, small businesses, associations is a great opportunity for folks to get in there. And there's lots of different levels to of intersectionality with when we're talking about workplace violence.
And then I'm seeing in the chat, let me just want to read that, Corinne. Right, exactly, in the chat, Magdalena wrote, and that's related to helping people get connected to unions, helping them unionize, helping them act collectively in their workplace. And I really want to emphasize too, sorry, Roy, I feel like I just cut you off hard, but I want to emphasize too, and not also, so something we really try to do is break down this dichotomy of like, I am the provider and you are the providee, but also thinking about like this plays out in our own workplaces. And I think my executive director would be totally fine with this. I mean, she, it was very public, but a year or so ago when myself and another colleague of mine, were about the same age, kind of same stages of life, we are now both, but we were talking about becoming pregnant and, parents and whatnot. And our workplace is so incredibly progressive, has such great things. So we're like, oh, let's go look at the maternity policy and see what that looks like. And it didn't exist. There was none. It was just your kind of standard FMLA of like unpaid, like fully unpaid leave. And we were just even two, but coalition staff are not giant, but the two of us at least then went to another person. And then, ultimately to our executive director, and we're like, okay, we literally teach about economic justice. We literally promote just economic policies, you know, largely for women that can help them, you know, if they are domestic violence survivors, if they become domestic violence survivors, you know, whatever it may be. And it is absolutely absurd that we don't have a maternity policy at an all, our staff was all women at the time, you know, like that's absolutely absurd. And so it's even looking at our own things and being able to be like, yeah, you know, our sick leave is this. It's not just you who might be working in like this factory setting or in this restaurant or Walmart or whatever it is. And it's also being able to challenge our own workplaces for these things, because it's real easy to tell survivors and to talk about unionizing and then to put your head in the sand and not think of like, you know, what does that look like for myself? And so I really would refuse to kind of talk to survivors about collective organizing and then be too afraid to actually do it for myself, because then it's you're just walking people kind of into the lion's den.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That authenticity and being genuine in the work that we do and our values in this you know particular movement is really important. And those are very real conversations that are happening local level at domestic violence programs, you know, state level, national level. And I think it's very warranted, right? We, again, if we're in a position where, you know, we're talking about economic justice initiatives, contextualizing the history and the history of all these intersectionalities, promoting policies, we also have to do the work internally. And recognize also that there are risks doing that. And so as we talk about these conversations, you know, we want to make sure that we are also supporting each other. So again, coming back to that, we're in relation with each other. They're hard conversations, but doing them, you know, together is really the initiative, is the framework that we would encourage folks to do, is to connect, is to help you know, believe in what we believe in, which is people power, right? And us together as colleagues in this work. I think we might have like 3 minutes left. Roy, please correct me if I'm wrong. If anybody does want to, oh, here we go, 5 minutes. I'm so sorry, I missed that. If anybody wants to come off mute and share an initiative that's really like within the economic justice framework, or a new and innovative thing, something that's really percolating after this conversation, please come off mute or share something in the chat box, and we will read that out. Someone did, Monica did write the ones when the community has a village and we discuss the issues in our own community and holding these accountable, and police being part of the community along with teachers, principals, all living in community. And thank you, Shafika, for sharing that. Sounds like as a result of those conversations, y'all were able to secure 12 weeks full pay. That is definitely an economic justice fight that sounds like there was positives that came out of that. It's wonderful.
Yeah. And if folks want to even put in the chat like something that you've maybe taken away or something that you want to ponder in these last couple, that, you know, is making you ponder in these last couple minutes, you know, feel free, unmute, go, you know, I know we're a small group, we're about 15 or so go in the chat, you know, do what you'd like to do.
So looks like Magdalena says, just remembering that there's so much around labor rights we can do as preventative work. Absolutely. Yeah. As I kept thinking about all of these different initiatives that we are talking about today, you know, the work is also very frankly just talking about the work, right? It might sound kind of silly or simple, But for folks who are out in community, are out at the forefront, you know, thinking about some promotoras that are in my area here, just out talking about things like this, talking about labor rights, talking about healthy workplaces, and the expectation should be that we have healthy, safe workplaces. That is the work, right? A lot of times we don't have to go and create 50 million different deliverables, but community work is literally just talking about these pieces and normalizing that conversation, just like we do with talking about domestic violence.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
You know, because it really makes people feel better. And like, if we're talking about prevention, you know, teens who are growing up in low income households, or young people, you know, in general, that a lot of times like prevention work is focused on, the same ways we give them and want to be giving them definitions for domestic violence and what is healthy and unhealthy. You know, it's doing the exact same for economic things, and being like, oh, you know, this isn't because this happened to you or whatnot. And so I kind of like that, because I know a lot of times, and I really get stuck in this mindset of like, oh, but what are we doing? You know, it's a very organizer mindset, which is important. You know, ultimately we want to do something too, but just talking about it actually makes people feel so much less isolated.
Yeah. Yeah, as I was thinking about it, it sounded so simple, right? And oftentimes, especially in different spaces, we make things a lot more complicated. When I was thinking about just some of this too, it's like, you know, just talking about the idea of a public bank as a investment in the community, in the city that you live in, right? Felt like, okay, what does that mean if we just start saying that idea out there, right? What does it mean if we start thinking about more organizing at organizations so that folks feel like they have people power, right? What does that look like about saying that we should just standardize care for each other in organizations that have, you know, a need for particular, you know, parental leave, things like that. Like, putting it out there means that we are setting the standard in community, right? And that should not be something that is, you know, scary or that we should shy away from, but that we are challenging ourselves to set as a baseline, as the standard for our community expectations.
Well, coming up on our kind of final minute, just wanted to say thanks everyone for, you know, coming, talking about these things. I believe our contact info is in the agendas, but if not, I'll drop my email here just in case.
And thanks for rolling with us today. We kind of just had to wing a little bit there. Apologies for needing some time there. But Shafika and I will just roll with things. So thanks for being flexible with us as well.
Yeah, we hope you enjoy the rest of the day and those sessions.
Great presentation, Mona and Shafika. Thank you so much for this information, and thank you, everybody.